Well, let's start. Ben, you brought up a good point. I want to remind you all that you need to sign up to preview your cystic fibrosis presentation. I think all have signed up, all the groups have signed up so far except for 3. So if you could get in your time slots, there are only a few left. So let me know what your preference is, and I can let you know if that's still available. I think all day on, let's see, let me look at my calendar. I think all day on Tuesday, the 11th of May is still available.
That was yesterday.
Add 7. Must be the 18th. Thanks for correcting me on that. All right, well, having said that about cystic fibrosis, I hope you're all aware that today you're having a quiz. Some of you have taken it already. Those of you who haven't, you have until midnight. So the topic for today then is natural selection and evolution. So let's get started on that. You see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, the motivation for this, and this is not a typical presentation on these topics. I'm reacting to the fact that we've spent a lot of time on Mendel and Mendelian inheritance. And we said at that time that equally important to Mendel is Darwin with his theory of evolution. And we've spent very little time talking about Darwin. So I want to give you more information about him and what he did, and then end up talking about evolution of our species, humans. So what are they? They have determined life's form since the beginning of life, and they'll continue to do so for as long as there is life. The definitions: natural selection is differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype. And I've emphasized reproduction here because that's what it's really all about. Natural selection requires reproduction, and because part of that reason is that reproduction involves variation. So that's one of the requirements, variation, and that comes from mutation or recombination or random assortment or all of them. And another source of variation is the random fertilization of eggs by sperm. Remember that each gamete is genetically unique. So in any collection of eggs, they're all unique. And among the millions of sperm that are produced, that each of them is unique genetically. The other requirement for natural selection is overproduction. You can't produce just enough to occupy the niche. There has to be more than enough so that natural selection can sort through this excess population and identify just the fittest, and all the rest will die. Now, evolution is the inherited, and I emphasize inherited change in a population of organisms over successive generations, leading to the appearance of new forms. So as the environment changes on the planet, and it does so continuously, it creates new niches, and these are occupied by new life forms specifically adapted to them. And that's due to the ability of natural selection to fill ecological niches. I want to make a couple of points about natural selection. I have this little cartoon up in the left here, which is a very simple way of expressing it. You have birds and you have beetles of two colors. The birds prefer the green ones. So those are the ones they choose, and over time they will have chosen all the green ones, and all that's left is orange ones. So that's natural selection, with the birds being the selectors. Now, another point I want to make is about the mechanism of evolution. So Darwin's theory is well known, and usually it's the only viable theory that people consider when talking about the mechanism of evolution. But occasionally you will run across the name Lamarck. Now, Lamarck was a French scientist. He was a contemporary of Darwin, and he had a completely different idea, which had some subscribers at the time, not many now, but sometimes people still do talk about Lamarckian inheritance. Well, it's the essence of it is that acquired traits are inherited. And that's illustrated here with giraffes. So the idea would be that ancestral giraffes stretch their necks by reaching high to get foliage from trees. And in the process of stretching their necks became longer and longer as they reached higher and higher. Now, when they had offspring, they inherited these stretched necks, so that over time, over generations, all the giraffes had long necks. As I said, this is not true. Darwin's idea is that the fittest among variants survive. The key difference here between them is genetics. So if you start with the ancestral giraffe, some with long necks, some with short, this difference is controlled by genetic differences. So when these giraffes breed, they produce both giraffes with long necks and short necks. The ones with long necks, because they have a better food supply, will produce more. So they simply outproduce the ones with short necks. So you end up with a population then of giraffes, all of which have long necks. So you see the key difference here, that acquired traits, something that happens during the lifespan of an individual, that is not inherited. Genetic differences are inherited. And it's those genetic differences that determine the reproductive rate of a population, individuals in a population.
Professor?
Yeah.
So, like I was talking to you earlier about evolution, isn't it an adaptation to the physical traits on their location as a species, like the Galapagos turtles? Same thing with the long necks and the short necks, depending on being able to adapt to their environment.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to make 2 points later. One is I will talk about the Galapagos and about the finches. And the other is I will make a distinction between evolution and adaptation. They're two distinctly different things. And I'll try to draw a sharp contrast between the two a little later. All right, Darwin's theory. Darwin lived from 1809 to 1882. In 1859, he published his seminal book after many years of studying and observing. The book is called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And it started a scientific revolution, which is still going on. Now, I'd like to stop sharing this and show you a video about evidence for evolution. Can you see a video here? Do you see a video?
Yes.
All right, then we'll...
Stated Clearly presents, what is the evidence for evolution? The theory of biological evolution makes two very bold claims about living creatures. First, all living things on Earth are related. They evolved from a common ancestor. Second, the evolution of living things is powered by natural processes, things which can be studied and understood. But is there really any evidence that these two claims are true? Yes. There are so many observable facts from so many different fields of study that the only way we can even begin to talk about them is to group them into categories or lines of evidence. To keep things simple, here we'll focus on evolution's first claim that all living things on Earth are related. We cannot tackle the entire tree of life at once. After all, there's an estimated 8.7 million species alive today. So instead, we'll focus most of our attention on one fairly small but fascinating branch of the evolutionary tree, cetaceans. This branch includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Biologists tell us that all these creatures are closely related and that the entire group evolved from an ancient four-legged land mammal. Instead of taking their word for it, let's look at the facts. We'll start by looking at a few from the field of comparative anatomy, the study of differences and similarities between living things. Whales live in water, and from a distance, they sort of look like giant fish. A close inspection of their anatomy, however, tells us a very different story. Whales, just like land mammals but unlike fish, have placentas and give live birth. They feed milk to their young. They are warm-blooded, which is extremely rare for a fish. And whales do not have gills. Instead, just like us, they breathe air with 2 fully developed lungs. Whales don't seem to have noses like mammals do. Instead, they breathe through blowholes coming out the tops of their heads. Some whales have 2 blowholes which almost look like nostrils, but dolphins and porpoises only have 1. Surprisingly, if you look at their skulls, you find that the blowhole splits into 2 nasal passages inside the head. Could it be that the blowhole is actually a highly modified mammal nose? It looks that way, but we'll need more evidence to be sure. Many whales have hair, just like land mammals. In this photograph, you can actually see the whiskers of this baby gray whale as he rests his chin on mama's back. Strangely, whales have arm, wrist, hand, and finger bones inside their front flippers. Here's a photo of these bones, the same bones that bats, hippos, and people have in their front appendages. 1 bone, 2 bones, wrist, hand, and finger bones. Modern whales do not have back legs, but they do have a strange pair of bones where the hind legs should be. Here's a picture of these bones from a bowhead whale. They almost look like shriveled hip, thigh, and shin bones. This one even has a ball and socket joint between the hip and thigh bone, just like the ball and socket joint in your own hip. Is this resemblance a mere coincidence, or are these real leg bones? Perhaps leftovers from the whale's evolutionary history? Before we draw any bold conclusions, let's see if a completely separate line of evidence will confirm our suspicions. Embryology is the study of how creatures develop before being born or hatching from an egg. Here we see a dolphin and a human embryo side by side at similar stages of development. Notice that they both have what look like arm buds and leg buds. In humans, the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow. These are all photographs of a common dolphin at different stages of growth. Notice that early on, we see 2 nostril grooves on the front of the face, just like you'd expect in a puppy or a human. As the dolphin continues to grow, the nostrils migrate to the top of the head and fuse together, becoming the dolphin's blowhole. So far, we have multiple facts from 2 independent lines of study, comparative anatomy and embryology, that are both telling us the same story. The ancestors of whales were once 4-legged land creatures. Will the fossil record act as a third witness, confirming this idea? These are 2 species of extinct basilosaurid whales. These animals are known for multiple well-preserved skeletons, and they appear to have lived side by side roughly 34 to 40 million years ago. In this photograph, we're looking down at the top of a basilosaurid skull. This is not a model or a cast. These are the actual bones which were pulled from the ground. Notice that the nasal opening is not on the top of the head like those of modern whales, and not at the end of the snout like those of land mammals. Instead, it's right in the middle. This is an intermediate species, exactly what evolution tells us we should find. At the back end of a basilosaurid's body, there are small yet fully developed hips, legs, ankle, feet, and toe bones. These legs are far too small for walking on land, but they may have been useful while mating or for scratching away parasites and itchy skin. Evolutionary theory tells us that the further we go back in time, the harder it should be to distinguish whales from normal land mammals. Meet Myocetus. The hip bones of Myocetus seem sturdy enough to walk on land, but this animal is considered to be a whale for many reasons. Their skeletons have all been found among fossils of sea creatures, which tells us they lived in the ocean. Their short legs, combined with long, flat fingers and toes, suggest they were strong swimmers with webbed hands and feet. Here we see the bottom side of a Myocetus jaw and skull. Her teeth match those of the basilosaurid whales we saw earlier, and the unique structures of her middle ear bones match those of basilosaurid whales and modern whales. Myocetus appears to be a walking whale. Scientists have found the fossils of many ancient whale-like mammals and continue to find more. Together, these fossils blur the line between four-legged land mammals and fully aquatic modern whales, solidifying the idea that whales indeed evolved from land creatures. Now let's look at a fourth line of evidence, DNA. DNA molecules contain chemical codes which act like recipes for living things. Without ever looking at bones, embryos, or anatomy, researchers can compare the DNA code of different living creatures to find out who is most closely related to who. Whale DNA has been compared to all kinds of other animals, fish, sea lions, you name it. And so far, the closest genetic match is to the pudgy, water-loving hippopotamus. This does not mean that whales evolved from hippos, but if this genetic finding is correct, whales and hippos both evolved from a common ancestor that lived roughly 54 million years ago. At first, the link between whales and hippos surprised researchers because whales are mainly carnivores. They eat things like fish and small crustaceans. Hippos, on the other hand, are mostly vegetarian. A closer look, however, reveals that hippos and whales actually share many strange features, some of which may have come from their common ancestor. Ancient walking whales have specially shaped ankle bones found only in hippos and the close relatives of hippos. Just like whales, hippos are known to give birth and even nurse their young underwater. They both have multi-chambered stomachs, which is common for herbivores, but is almost unheard of for meat-eating mammals. They are both missing a coat of fur, and here's a fun fact. Whales and hippos are among the only mammals on Earth that have internal testicles. So there you have it. 4 independent lines of evidence all tell us the exact same story. Whales evolved from four-legged land mammals. But the history of whales is not the only evolutionary history that we've been able to work out. We know from fossils, DNA, embryology, and many other lines of evidence that bird wings are actually modified arms and claws. Birds evolved from dinosaur-like ancestors. We can also clearly see that bat wings evolved from 5-fingered hands, very similar to those of monkeys and shrews. We've found that humans share a fairly recent common ancestor with chimpanzees, that mammals evolved from reptile-like creatures, those reptile-like creatures evolved from amphibian-like creatures, those amphibian-like creatures evolved from fish-like creatures, and fish, if you go back far enough, share a common ancestor with segmented worms. So to sum things up, thousands of observable facts from completely independent fields of study have come together to tell us the exact same story. All living things on Earth are related. I'm John Perry, and that's a basic overview of the evidence for evolution, stated clearly.
Professor, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What chapter it is for the textbook for this PowerPoint?
There isn't one. You can look in the index for
Oh,
natural selection or evolution, but I haven't modeled this after anything from the textbook.
so today PowerPoint is have nothing to do with the textbook, right?
Yeah, there are some things in common, but this was developed pretty much independently from the textbook or any book for that matter.
Oh, okay.
But, the slide set is in Canvas, and the recording of this session will also be once it's available. Now, I want to go back to Darwin and tell you some things about Darwin's background and how he went about gathering evidence that led him to the conclusion that things evolve, living things evolve. So he lived in the mid-1800s, and he took a trip on a ship called the Beagle. You see a drawing of it here, sailing ship. The trip took 5 years, leaving England in December of 1831, got to the Galapagos Islands about 4 years later, and got back to England a year after that in 1836. The map shows the route. So they left from Plymouth, England, followed the coast of Africa, across the Atlantic to the coast of South America. That's where many stops were made at various different places. Then rounded the Cape north along the western South American coast to Ecuador. And it's in Ecuador that the Galapagos Islands are located. And you see that enlarged here at the lower right. Here's Ecuador, the country. The Galapagos Islands are offshore. And I want to make a point about the importance of islands, particularly the Galapagos Islands. So islands allow for physical isolation of populations so that evolution can occur independently on each of the islands, independent of all the other islands. And that results in species developing specifically, adapted specifically to the condition on a particular island. So Darwin was lucky that, that his ship stopped in a set of islands, the Galapagos, and that he was observant enough to notice differences when he went from island to island, differences among the birds. Also shown here are pictures of turtles. The word Galapagos in Spanish means turtles. And these islands have this unusual species of very large turtles. You can see in comparison to the size of a human, just how big these turtles are. Darwin was quite taken with these turtles. In fact, at one point, he described climbing on the one's back and riding it. At any rate, these turtles are distinctive. I think they're unique to the Galapagos, and they almost went extinct during the height of the whaling industry because they provided fresh meat for whaling boats. You can imagine an animal of this size has a lot of meat on it. A turtle can go without food for many months. So turtles would be collected by whaling ships, and one by one, as meat was needed, they could be butchered, and the crew would have fresh meat. So they were hunted almost to extinction, but not quite. And it's my understanding, if you go to the Galapagos today, you might see a Galapagos turtle. An important point to make here is that this trip, the ship, the crew, and the captain were not interested in science, at least not as a primary subject. They had other priorities. Darwin was a young man then in his early 20s, and he was allowed to go along just as an observer to see what he could see. His studies were secondary. And of course, history now tells us that it was really his observations that were the primary benefit of this voyage. So what was the captain charged with doing? Well, first of all, to survey the coast of South America and secure the safety of British shipping. Then, curiously, another objective was to return 3 natives to Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America. And Darwin made a note in one of his journals that to settle these natives in their own country was one of the chief inducements of the captain. Another peculiar goal was to have this priest, this Reverend Matthews from the Anglican Church, was to establish a mission for the Fuegians. He tried, but that attempt failed. So while all this was going on, the ship was stopping periodically. Everybody would go on land. And while the crew would be surveying, Darwin was at his leisure to do whatever he wished. And what he did was make observations and collect specimens. And he preserved these and sent them back to England, where he could study them later after he returned. So my point here is that the ship had one set of priorities, and they were not Darwin's priorities. Now, this little cartoon is kind of silly, but it does illustrate the effect of time and of islands. So if you go to the upper left, 2 million years ago, these birds named finches lived on the Galapagos Islands, and they multiplied. And with time, they started to see variance. So some were smaller, some were larger, some were different color, some had different beaks, and some were better adapted to compete for resources than others. And the ones that weren't well adapted died. So with time, the ones with similar features collected on different islands in the Galapagos and eventually became different species because their populations were isolated. But what was Darwin interested in? Well, first of all, in birds and these particular finches. And what he noticed was this variation in beak size. Noticed that on some islands, the birds had these heavy, thick beaks. They lived on the ground and they ate large seeds and had these heavy beaks to crack them open. Other finches lived on the ground, but they didn't eat seeds. They ate parts of cactus. Others ate plant buds and others ate insects. And so you see here to the right, this diagram shows the different food sources, seeds, insects, fruits, and the beaks of the birds that had those food sources. And you can see that as you go from finch to finch, and this is really going from island to island, the beaks were varied a lot. Darwin was apparently a pretty good artist. These are actually line drawings that he made, I think after he got back to England, representing the different beak morphologies. He also drew pictures of the turtles that he liked so much. And this is where Darwin's observations come to meet Mendel's contributions in genetics. Remember, we talked earlier about how Mendel and Darwin together really shaped the nature of biology. So with modern technology, it's now possible to identify some of the genes that make evolution of beak shape and size possible. And I've listed 3 of those genes here. BMP4, bone morphogenetic protein. It's active in the developing embryo, and its differential expression results in variation of beak size and shape. There's a calmodulin encoding gene that helps to regulate beak growth. And then there's a gene called ALX1, which is a transcription factor. That is, it controls it's a control switch for genes that are involved in craniofacial development. In other words, the head and the face in not only in birds, but in other organisms as well. So what's important here is that these 3 genes and others have been identified and shown that allelic differences at these loci occur on different islands. So in other words, islands that have finches with big, thick beaks have alleles of these genes that control development of big, thick beaks. So we have Mendel's contribution joining up with Darwin's observations so that we can define the actors in evolution. I put this in just to illustrate the effect of islands. You can see that along the islands, different finches with different beaks populated them and actually turned into species over time. So if you think about it, if Darwin had observed these birds that were not on islands, if there was a mixed population over some area of land, he probably wouldn't have noticed the correlation between beaks and particular islands. Now here's something that happened in real time and happened recently in the mid-1970s. There was a drought on the Galapagos Island of Daphne major. This drought occurred in 1977, and it reduced the number of small seeds. So the plants that made small seeds were particularly affected by this drought, so there were very few small seeds made. Some finches are adapted, they have small beaks adapted to eating small seeds. They couldn't eat the larger ones, so they starved. Their beaks were too small to eat big seeds. So this caused an increase in finches' average beak size over the course of 2 years. And that's shown in these 2 graphs above, where you have the percentage of individuals in each depth class. You can see how the depths were measured from the bottom of the jaw to the top. And in 1976, the mean beak depth was 9.5 millimeters. 2 years later, it was 10.2 millimeters, which is statistically significant. And the reason for this is the drought. If there were no seeds for the birds with small beaks, they couldn't compete. They couldn't reproduce as well as the ones with big beaks, and so their population declined.
Professor,
Mm-hmm.
so you're saying they declined, but they didn't die off completely. So will we eventually see small beak finches again once the drought's over, or will they always be that 10.9 because they've adapted? Will it go back and forth, or?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I haven't read about the follow-up of this. I would expect that once the drought was over, the small seeds would reappear, and whatever small beaked birds were still left then recovered their populations. That would be my guess. Okay, anything else about this It's not really an experiment, it's more an observation. Okay, so there was reluctance to accept Darwin's theory of evolution when he first published it in 1859. The scientific thought of that time simply was not compatible with the idea of evolution. I've taken a sentence out of a scientific paper at that time, which says innovations cannot possibly come into existence through the accumulation of many small steps, which is what evolution predicts. And even if they can, natural selection cannot accomplish this because incipient and intermediate stages are not advantageous. So why they thought this way, I don't know, but this was the general type of thinking that excluded natural selection and evolution as a valid phenomenon. The turning point actually came in the late 1800s by observations of the peppered moth. And these observations convinced most biologists, both then and since then, that the evolution theory is valid. So what is a peppered moth? Here's the original population, light-colored moths, and a population of dark-colored moths after natural selection. So the light-colored moths are better camouflaged against a light, pristine environment, whereas dark-colored moths are better camouflaged against a sooty environment. So that as the Industrial Revolution progressed in 19th century England, the color of the moth population shifted from light to dark. But here are peppered moths in various different surfaces. Here's a light-colored one on a green leaf. Here are both a dark and a light-colored one on a light-colored background. You can see that the dark one is much more visible than the light one. So for contrast, we'll compare two locations in England. One is Dorset. Geographically, Dorset is located on the southern coast of England. It's a fishing village, has little or no air pollution. So the color of the tree trunks in Dorset are light. In contrast, in Manchester, which is in the center of England, the economy is heavy industry, which you see here, spewing air pollution. And this air pollution, the soot in it, colored the tree trunks dark. So you can see that on a light-colored, in Dorset, a light-colored tree trunk, you can hardly see the light-colored moth. The black one, the dark one, is highly visible. In contrast, in a polluted environment, in Manchester, it's the opposite. Now on this sooty tree trunk, the light-colored moth is more visible and the dark moth is not. Remember that these moths are prey for birds. So if a bird is looking for something to eat, it's much easier in a polluted environment to see a light-colored moth. So what happened over time is that the population of moths shifted from light to dark in places like Manchester. As the tree trunks turned darker and darker, the populations of light-colored moths got lower and lower. And here is a graph illustrating the results of an experiment where equal numbers of moths, 50% light, 50% dark, were released at the same time in an environment that had light-colored tree bark. And then what was counted was the percent of moths remaining of dark versus light. And what's plotted here is moth generations over time. So 1 through 5 generations. And what you can see is that the selection pressure of birds, since this is light colored tree bark, they could easily see the dark moths and ate them preferentially, so that over 5 generations, the population of dark moths decreased dramatically, and the percentage of the population that was light increased correspondingly. So this experiment illustrates in a short amount of time what happened over a long period of time in the Industrial Revolution in England. So it was this obvious demonstration, sort of a natural demonstration of evolution, that convinced people, especially scientists, of the validity of the theory of evolution. Now you can do evolution in a test tube in a short amount of time. If you're using a population that has a rapid generation time, like bacteria, which has a generation time of about 20 minutes. So what you see at the top here is a population of bacteria, variations in green color. So during division, one bacterial cell undergoes a mutation in its DNA that results in antibiotic resistance. So at this point, you introduce a new environmental niche by adding an antibiotic that kills all the bacterial cells except the mutant. The mutant is resistant. So it's the only one that survives, and as it continues to divide, creates an entirely new population of bacteria, all of which are resistant to the antibiotic. So this is a way that you can demonstrate evolution in a small amount of space and a small amount of time. We talked earlier a little bit about evolution and how it's distinct from adaptation. And I'd like to elaborate on that point now. Adaptation is a component of the evolutionary process, but it's not evolution. It's the ability to adapt is heritable, but the adaptation itself is not heritable. So in adaptation, individuals adjust over short terms. The adaptation is non-permanent. And in evolution, it's a long-term process wherein changes occur at the genetic level for functioning and survival. And I show you here 2 examples of adaptation. One is the Arctic fox, which in the summer, when its background is dark, the fur coat of the fox is dark. In the winter, when it spends most of its time on snow, it's white. And similarly, the Arctic ptarmigan is dark in the summer and white on snow in the winter. So an individual can switch back and forth from one coloration to the other every season. This is not evolution, it's a seasonal adaptation. So again, I'll go back to emphasize that the ability to adapt, the ability to switch colors is heritable, but the color switch is not heritable. In other words, if this white bird reproduces, it's not going to produce all white ptarmigans. It's going to produce ptarmigans that can switch back and forth. Another example is chameleons. They can adapt to light rays. And the way they do this, under their skin, they have guanine crystals, which the spaces between them can be changed. And when they are changed, the wavelength of light that's reflected changes color. And that changes the color of the skin. There's a lot of speculation and studies of why the chameleons do this, but it's generally thought that changing color is social signaling to attract a mate or repel a foe, a predator.
Professor,
Yeah.
this is Sierra. I just wanted to ask what heritable, what that means. I'm sorry if I missed that.
Heritable means genetic.
Okay.
So it's a genetic change. So again, I emphasize, and it's a good question. I emphasize that the ability to adapt, the ability to have an adaptation is heritable. In other words, it's controlled by genes. The ability is controlled by genes. So the ability to switch colors is controlled by genes. But the switching of colors itself is not controlled by genes. It's not heritable. So that's a sort of a fine point, but it's an important one. Now, today's class is short because you have a quiz. In the little bit of time we have left, I'd like to talk about the evolution of humans. So here's a map, pretty much of the world, showing where humans came from, Africa. All humans and all species related to humans came from Africa. There's no evidence of any other source of humans anywhere in the world. One of the species related to humans that evolved in Africa are the Neanderthals. Well, the Neanderthals migrated out of Africa about 400,000 years ago. So they migrated through the Middle East and settled colonies throughout this area that is colored in tan. They lived there for quite a long time. And as they did, they adapted to the climate. So at the time 400,000 years ago, it was during the ice ages and glaciers in Europe. And so these Africans had to acquire mutations that allowed them to survive in this harsh environment. And they did that over the course of 400,000 years, more like 340,000 years. Now, modern humans were evolving in Africa at the same time. Well, they migrated out about 60,000 years ago. In other words, 340,000 years after the Neanderthals did. And the modern humans were faced with the same problem that the Neanderthals had, which is they're from a warm tropical climate, and now they're in a harsh, cold environment. So humans actually had a choice. They could spend the next 340,000 years evolving to fit the climate, as the Neanderthals had done, or they could mate with the Neanderthals and in that way borrow the genes that they had acquired for adaptation to the European climate. And humans chose to do B. So how do we know all this? Primarily because of the work of one man, Svante Pääbo. who in 2010 sequenced the genomes of 3 Neanderthals obtained from bone fragments preserved in a cave in Croatia. Now, the first human genome was completely sequenced in 2003, and just 7 years later, Pabo was able to sequence 3 Neanderthals. Now, how did he do it? Well, he relied entirely on a technology known as PCR, polymerase chain reaction. We haven't talked about that yet. We will next time when we talk about molecular technologies. But using PCR, Pabo was able to sequence Neanderthals. And here is an imaginary, the appearance of a Neanderthal woman imagined from the DNA in some of the bones. The DNA sequence indicated that she was an inbred. Her father was the half-brother of her mother. So at the present time, then this is the situation. Neanderthal DNA in contemporary humans. Most humans on the planet have some Neanderthal DNA. None in Africa. Europeans and Japanese have about 2.7%, Chinese 2.5%, Polynesians 4%, and I have 3.1%, relatively high for Caucasians. So Neanderthal DNA is widely distributed among human populations, but there is none among Africans. So why is that? Look at this map and try to imagine why Africans have no Neanderthal DNA.
Because they migrated away from it.
Yeah, they migrated away from it. They migrated first and never migrated back. So in other words, humans acquired the Neanderthal genes by migrating out to be with them. The Neanderthals never went back to Africa to bring their genes back. So that's why present day Africans don't have any Neanderthal DNA, because they had no contact with Neanderthals, and now they're extinct. So there's no way they can get it. You can do, or we can do, an Mendelian inheritance exercise, imagining the breeding between humans and Neanderthals. So if we think about what was the parental cross, and there must have been at least one parental cross, probably a lot of them, where a human bred with a Neanderthal. The progeny of that cross would be 50% human genes and 50% Neanderthal genes. Now, in this illustration, we're going to assume that the back cross, in other words, a child from this parental cross, grew up and mated with a human. So the progeny, the children from that mating, now had 75% human genes and 25% Neanderthal genes. You see it happened again, a child from this cross now crossed again with a human. Now it's 87 and 12. Another back cross to a human, it's 93 and 6. And finally, yet another back cross, it's 96, 97 versus 3%. And this now is in the range of the Neanderthal DNA in the human genome right now. So after only 4 to 5 generations, after the initial parental cross, the percent of Neanderthal DNA in human genome reached the level that it is today, between 1% and 4%. And so this took only 80 to 100 years, assuming 20 years per generation. So the conclusion from this is that there is a portion somewhere, some low percentage, 1 to 4% of the human genome that is Neanderthal genes is essential. It's important to humans, it's important to their evolution, because if it wasn't, it would have been lost over time. We know that 95% of the Neanderthal genome has been lost. And so why hasn't it all been lost? And it must be, the only explanation for that is that it's important to humans. So is that clear? Does that make sense? We're really out of time, but one thing I want you to consider, but this illustration is backcrossing to humans. What if the backcrossing was to a Neanderthal recurrent parent? So think about that and think of what the conclusion would be. Just very briefly, and then I'll let you go. What phenotypes have we inherited from the Neanderthals? Well, one is fair skin. It's advantageous because it's much better at generating vitamin D than dark skin, especially when the light is low. Straight, thick hair is a better insulator than kinky hair, and large eyes can receive light better than smaller eyes. Neanderthals required large eyes to enable them to have clear vision in weak sunlight. Now, there are some Neanderthal traits that persist in a human population that there's no obvious reason for. Here are two skulls, a Neanderthal and a human. Neanderthal, you see, has this thick, heavy brow and what's called an occipital bun on the back. Humans don't have that, except for occasionally. Here you see a Neanderthal type brow, and here you see a Neanderthal type occipital bun. As I said, there's no obvious reason for these to have persisted in the human population over thousands of years, but they have. Okay, that's it. I run over time, but that's it for today. Any questions quick before we go? And then you can get back to doing the quiz.
Is any of this from tonight going to be on the quiz or?
No,
Okay.
no, this will not be on the quiz. It'll be on, if we have another quiz, it'll be on that. If not, it will be on test 4, the last test.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right, then I will stop sharing. And I will see you all on Monday.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.